Chapter 15. Naruto, Desert Flower. Next morning. Tsunade no Sato. Namake's households. Naruto woke up with a groan hearing the alarm clock ringing and slammed his hand on it, shutting it up. He had been up late last night due to their date already, and he didn't want to get up. He felt soft lips and tingling warm breath over his neck and grunted. He opened his eyes to see his princess looking at him with a smile and a faint pink blush. She pecked his lips softly, and he smiled, bringing her in for a hug. "You're up early today, Haim," he said softly, and she nodded on his chest while he played with her hair. "Hi, we have that small gathering of dignitaries at the resort today, remember?" She spoke softly, running circles on his chest, and he nodded, remembering it. He kissed the top of her head, making her smile and cuddle up to him. "We won't be able to have any alone time for the next couple of days, I suppose, then?" he asked, and she nodded slowly on his chest. He pulled her closer by the waist and captured her lips in a soft kiss, making her moan in pleasure, and he smiled at him, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear, gently making her blush. "What do you say to a little shower then?" he asked, and she glared at him slightly. "No," she said flatly, and he looked at her in mock hurt. "Why not?" he asked, and she glared harder. "Because I know you will send me to the meeting with a limp," she said flatly with a blush, and he chuckled softly. "Oh, come on, I'm not that bad." He trailed off, seeing her flat look. "I'll be gentle," he whispered, kissing her cheek, and she blushed and looked at him angrily. She wanted to say no, but her cupped her cheeks and looked at her lovingly. "We don't know if we would get another chance again for the next 2 days or not," he spoke softly, kissing her neck, and she moaned and grabbed his head, cradling it in her arms while he kissed her neck. "No, stop, Naruto," she whispered half-heartedly, and he stopped, surprised at her refusal. "Why are you angry with me? Was I too rough last time?" he asked, gently kissing her on the cheek, and she smiled and shook her head. "No, remember what you promised me yesterday before Kankuro showed up?" she said, making him smile warmly and nod. "We'll have the complete day after the finals to ourselves, and I want you to make love to me all day. I want to have a family, Naruto," she whispered softly, and he smiled, kissing her forehead softly and pulled her in a bear hug. "I love you so much, Mari-chan." "All right, we'll do it after the finals, and I want a family too," he whispered softly, and she smiled and kissed his cheek. "But we can still have a shower together, right?" he asked, and she nodded as he stood up and quickly pulled her up bridal style, making her squeal in glee. "We will make out in the shower at the very least. You won't be able to keep me away from you completely," he said, walking in the bathroom while she snuggled in his chest and nodded. He put her down on her feet and took off his clothes in the shower. He heard the shower turning on and looked back to see the silhouette of his wife in the steam, and smiled, walking in behind her. He wrapped his arms around her slender waist from behind and made her turn around in his arms. He looked at her dripping form and her naked body pressed against his, capturing her lips as the hot water flowed over them in between their kisses. Temari moaned as she felt his loving lips capture hers in a passionate kiss, and she kissed him back equally hungrily. They made out for 5 minutes in the shower when she felt something hard between her legs and knew what it was. He was hard already, and she knew he wanted her, but wasn't going any further. "You want it, don't you?" she asked softly, hugging him, and he nodded in her neck, brushing her wet hair to the side, making her smile. She held him for a few moments and kissed his cheek gently and brought her lips to his ear. "Make it quick," she purred in his ear softly, and he smiled and nodded. "Arigato," he whispered, pushing her against the wall and lifting up her left leg with his right arm, opening her love hole to him. She grabbed his stiff member in her hand and pulled him in a hug, stroking him softly, making him grunt in pleasure. "How much do you love me?" she asked softly, kissing his neck, and he grunted as she rubbed his tip on her opening while softly stroking him, teasing him within her hold. "More than you know." He grunted and tried to push in when she held him back and kept stroking him. She gazed into his lust-filled eyes that were glazed from pleasure. She felt his hand go down to her pussy to rub when she grabbed his wrist, and he looked at her in confusion. "What if I stop you right now?" she asked softly and kept stroking him, pulling his hand to her neck. "Please don't," he grunted, thrusting lightly in her hand, and she smiled at hearing his vulnerable and needy voice. "What if I do?" she asked, feeling him getting stiffer than ever and twitching ever so lightly. "You wouldn't," he said vulnerably, looking in her eyes while she kept stroking him. "Oh, I would," she whispered mischievously, and he looked into her eyes to see her serious and not just teasing him. She really would do it. She was just playing with him. He put her leg down and unwrapped himself from her arms. She looked at him confused when he walked out of the shower, much to her surprise, grabbing a towel on his way out. She was just playing with him and had no plans to go all the way today. "Naruto," she asked, confused as she walked out in a towel wrapped around her to see him putting on his pants and shirt. She was even more confused when he didn't answer her. "Naruto," she asked again in a small voice, and she gasped as she looked into his pained eyes. "You really would have stopped, wouldn't you?" he asked softly, and she was stunned at his question and didn't say anything. She was just playing with him and wasn't going to go the whole way. He saw her silence and smiled sadly. He put on his shirt and walked out, completely forgetting his jacket and headband along the way. He stopped as he put his hand on the doorknob and looked at her with hurt eyes, making her eyes water. "You shouldn't play with our moments like that," he said softly, making her gasp as she brought her hands to her mouth in shock, and a tear rolled down her eye. She realized that she had hurt him and went too far with her prank. Naruto walked out, closing the door behind him, and she gasped and ran out to see him already gone, probably had flashed away, and started sobbing. She was so stupid. She knew how much he loved her, and his words rang in her mind. "You shouldn't play with our moments like that." It was true, she had tried to prank him into making love. She had crossed a boundary she shouldn't have with her stupid joke and prank. She remembered his vulnerable voice in his last moments when he was with her in her arms. She should have realized he wasn't in the mood for pranks and really wanted to go further, or she shouldn't have baited him on to the last moment like that. She needed to apologize to him. She glanced at the clock to see she was already running nearly on time to go to the gathering and cursed inwardly. She decided to give him some time to calm down and make up to him later on. She put on her dress with the same kimono from the previous time she had worn to represent her village. She had to wear it on the 3 meetings, including the finals tomorrow. She got dressed in her same black kimono and pulled up her hair in a loose bun with the sanbon that had a ruby embedded on one of its ends. She walked down the stairs of her house and put on her sandals. She glanced back into the empty house and her eyes watered. They had been so happy, and he had made her feel so special by taking her on that date last night to celebrate their decision for a family, and she had ruined it all with one of her stupid pranks. She missed him already. He should have been here kissing her and wrapping his arms around her while he walked her through the village. It felt weird to leave the house like that with such a heavy heart. She composed herself and walked out with a small sigh, locking the door behind her. Meanwhile, with Naruto. Naruto walked down the streets of the village with an emotionless mask marred over his face. It hurt him that she would play with him like that, and he didn't want to do anything stupid, so he had flashed away to the nearest marker as soon as he left the room. Maybe he had overreacted and she was just playing lightheartedly. He sighed tiredly. Maybe he should have listened to her first before just walking out. He was so confused with himself he didn't even realize when he had reached the Kazekage Tower and his office. He sat down on his desk, pumping chakra into the seals on them to send out a small beacon as 2 figures appeared in his office, bowing politely. "Baki, Dragon, call every shinobi under your commands to the clearing in front of the Kazekage Tower under the tower," he said emotionlessly, not looking up from the small file in front of him to see the 2 stupefied commanders of the village. Everyone, both stuttered out in unison, and Naruto gazed up with cold, icy cerulean blue eyes with such intensity that both gulped. Did I stutter? He asked coldly, and both shook their heads furiously, seeing he was in no mood for any questions today, while holding their breaths as he turned his eyes. Both were shell-shocked at the sudden gathering of the forces they were commanded, and were building up their confidence to speak to their aggravated commander when his voice cut in the silence like hot knife through butter. In 30 minutes, or don't return to your commands tomorrow. He said coldly, making their words die down in their throats, and sweat to roll down their heads when his blank face turned to them again. They saw he was not in a good mood today, on one of those rare occasions. Dismissed. He said emotionlessly, and both ran out scrambling from the room, forgetting that they could use Shunshin to leave completely. He turned his attention back to the file in front of him to take his attention of the tension that had formed in the morning between him and his Heim. He glanced at the clock to see it had been 25 minutes and stood up. He walked down the hallways of the tower as everyone made way for him, seeing his void aura that was surrounding him this morning. He stood in front of the crowd assembled to see two panting commanders kneel down in front of him. They are all here. Namikaze-sama. Both said in between pants, and he nodded, motioning for them to stand with them, and gazed at the various shinobi all standing there looking at their commander curiously, and he could hear the slight murmuring in between them. Is there something you all have that is more interesting for you to talk about rather than paying attention to your commander who is standing in front of you? He asked in a normal voice, not shouting or speaking loudly, and the whole forces turned deathly silent as the man they respected the most took command of them. The power and authority his voice held instantly commanded their complete attention. No, Namikaze-sama. He heard them say in unison and standing at attention, and he nodded. Tora, Nico, Inutori, step forward. He said in his normal voice, and the 4 ANBU stood in front of the crowd. The 4 knew why they were here from the events of last night. I was out late last night with my wife, and we were walking through the streets when I found a lost, crying little civilian girl, no older than 5 years, in the death of night. She was completely scared and alone, not knowing where she was, and wanted to go home. He started as all eyes focused on his commanding tone unblinkingly. These 4. He motioned for them, who gulped beneath their masks, seeing every eye turn to them. Found their missions for looking after internal security much more prudent than for one of them to walk out and help the little crying child. They obeyed the rules of their commanding officers perfectly, choosing the mission over the little girl. He said, and all of them nodded, looking at the 4 ANBU, who wanted to hold their heads down in shame knowing what was coming next. Now I have a small question for all of you. He said, and all of them looked at their commander curiously. Do you think they made the right choice? Those who do, please raise their hands. He said, holding his hands behind his back, and gazed at all of them icily, when almost 80% of the hands, including his ANBU and Jounin commanders, much to his shame, were within them. I see. He said, slowly looking at them, and smiled a small smile. Those who didn't raise their hands, please move to the left side. He said, and gazed at them, seeing they were all just newly minted genin, and smiled inwardly, seeing their nervous faces, thinking they had made the wrong choice. He turned to the rest of the forces with a smile, making them all smile proudly at their experienced choice when the words left his lips through his smile. I'm ashamed to call myself your commander. I guess I am not a capable leader. He said, as all of them broke out in protest after a moment of silence, absorbing his words, saying it wasn't true. He raised his hand slightly, and they turned silent as he spoke up. Think that all of you were in these 4 places. He said, turning to Baki and Dragon, who nodded in affirmative, seeing his firm tone leaving no room for arguments. Think that the girl was in the hands of some psychopath or rapist. He said, as their blood ran cold, imagining a 5-year-old girl in such a fate. And you were supposed to report to me the next day, seeing her mutilated body, that you saw the girl last night, and instead of the one of you going off from the rules, you stuck by them. He said, when shame felt their hearts, and he continued. And you had to report it to the father whose child had suffered such a fate that you could have made a difference by disobeying the rules of your commanders, but you stuck by them. He said, and every eye averted his own. Now I ask, how many of you would have chosen the rules over the girl's safety? he asked, and no hand was raised, and he nodded appreciatively. Now you understand what it means to be a shinobi, he said as all eyes turned up to him again. From this day on, you will not follow the rules blindly and make the choices you think are right. You aren't tools, you are shinobi. You have minds. You have hearts. Use them and think before you make a choice. If a situation like last night arises, and you all leave the mission parameters to do what was right, I would be proud to have called myself your commander, he said as fire burned within their eyes hearing his words. Every civilian, shinobi, child and adult alike are a responsibility. Take out your hands to help each other, whether they be clan heads or civilians. His voice rung in the crowd, and they nodded, knowing the small discrimination that he was trying to remove by that statement. My sensei didn't teach me much, but his first lesson I live by to this day, even if he himself never adopted it, he said as they all listened on with held breaths, knowing how important the next words must mean to their commander. Those who abandon rules in the shinobi world are scum, and that's true, he said, gaining nods from each and every one of them. But those who abandon even one of their comrades for their rules are even worse than scum. His words rung, stopping the nods. Each and every one is our comrade and our responsibility. From this day on, I shouldn't hear reports that we lost someone to fulfill the mission. If it doesn't work with plan A, then follow plan B, he said when a hand raised from the crowd from a female chunin, who blushed when he motioned for her to speak. She had a crush on the man in front of her and wanted to ask a question, but was surprised he was letting her instead of calling her off. What if plan B fails Tsunade-sama, she asked, and he smiled a little, making her blush intensify, and all eyes to turn to him awaiting the answer. Well, the solution is simple, and the one I live by personally, he said, gaining curious looks from everyone. If both fail, then create a plan C yourself. Improvise and try to cut as many losses as you could while trying to fulfill your objective. But never do so by abandoning a comrade. Sacrificing yourself is different, and forfeiting a comrade to the wolves is different. Understand the difference, or you are no better than bandits. Are my words and my message to every shinobi on this side clear? He asked commandingly to all those who had raised their hands, and their respect for their commander increased tenfold, and they nodded in unison. Hai Namikaze-sama, their voice rang in unison, and he nodded, turning to the fresh genin, who didn't raise their hands, with a proud smile. I'm proud that our young blood has hearts of gold. Looks like the future of the sand is in safe hands. Making all of them embarrassed, and got nods when he turned to all of them, looking at him curiously. He rose an eyebrow at their expectant gazes. What am I, a baboon doing a performance? He asked in an amused and light-hearted tone, getting face faults throughout the crowd at his reversal in behavior, and he smirked as his authoritative voice rang again. We have the Chunin exams final tomorrow, Suna Shinobi, and we need our village secure. Now get your asses in gear and do some work. Dismissed, he said loudly, and all the forces scrambled back to their posts when he heard snickering behind him to see an amused Gaara and a laughing Kankuro, and sighed. That was interesting, Gaara said in an amused tone, making him smile. I knew I made the right choice choosing you, Naruto. You really should take my hat, you know, he said, and Naruto smirked and walked past him as Gaara handed him a small official sealed scroll that he pocketed with a smile. No, you can keep the paperwork, and I can keep the shinobi affairs. It's better that way, he said, and flashed away when a sand tendril pierced where he was a moment ago, making Gaara growl. I swear I'll get the secret to his paperwork technique, whatever it is, one day, he said, and Kankuro followed him laughing to the gathering, for which they were already late. Now he understood why he had chosen this time. With all of the outsiders attending the gathering, the forces were almost free for a small gap at that moment. Meanwhile, with Temari. Temari entered the resort in her elegant clothing with the elegance of a princess, and saw almost all heads turn to the representative of Suna exam finals and started greeting her happily. She smiled a small fake smile, greeting them all formally, and dismissing them as politely as she could when she saw Tsunade coming her way, and much to her surprise didn't have a cup of sake in her hands. "Temari, I was looking for you." She chirped happily, and Temari rose an eyebrow and nodded. "What can I do for you, Tsunade-sama?" she asked, getting a smile from the woman. "You know I have always liked you," she said, gaining a small nod in return when Tsunade smiled. "And that is a really pretty ring, and the design of it is rather interesting," she said, emphasizing on the word interesting, and Temari covered it with her other hand with a small nervous smile. "Thank you, Tsunade-sama," she said with a nervous smile, and Tsunade smiled widely, taking a small chicken skewer in her hand and walked beside her. "And you know the delicacies of Suna are rather delicious," she said, taking a bite from the skewer, and Temari smiled from the compliment. She had made the arrangements, and she was proud to hear a heartfelt compliment. "But yesterday I visited a rather interesting new restaurant in the shopping district, and I must say the food there is delicious," she said, and Temari looked at her curiously, putting some food on her plate from the table as they walked side by side. "Really, which one is that, Tsunade-sama?" she asked innocently, and Tsunade smiled. "It has a rather peculiar speciality, and has originated from Konoha. I'm sure you must know of it. Ichiraku's ramen," she said in a low voice only audible to her, and Temari was pulled aside by Tsunade as she gulped, seeing her sweet smile. They were in the corner out of everyone's earshot now. "Your ring has the shape of a nine-tailed fox. Naruto's favorite ramen stand, Ichiraku's, moved its business from Konoha to Suna of all places after 30 years of business there, just when their business was booming. Those coincidences are too much." "He is alive, isn't he?" she asked desperately with teary eyes, and Temari sighed, seeing her motherly voice, and nodded when Tsunade hugged her tightly, glomping her like a mother. "I knew it, my Gaki wasn't one to die so easily." "How is he?" "He is happy here, right?" she asked rapidly in a soft and caring voice, and Temari nodded with a small smile. "He is here, Tsunade-sama, and he is very happy. He misses you dearly. The only one he still cares about from the leaf are you and Shizen-san," she said kindly in a soft voice, and Tsunade's eyes softened with a fond smile, and tears flowed down her eyes as she pulled her behind a small plant out of everyone's eyesight. "So he is your fiancé too, right?" she asked softly, taking her hand with the ring, gazing at it happily, making Temari smile and shake her head in negative, and cut her off as she tried to voice her confusion. "He is my husband now, Tsunade-sama," she said softly, and Tsunade's eyes widened in shock as her tears renewed, and she glomped her again, much to her embarrassment, but saw the happiness in her eyes and the true concern for her lover. "Oh, he chose so well, now I'm sure to have blonde grandchildren," she said, and Temari blushed and looked down, making Tsunade beam at no denial to her words. "Oh my God, you two have that plan too," she said gleefully, and Temari's blush intensified, and she nodded when Tsunade asked the next question. "Where is he? I need to meet him, please," she said desperately, and Temari looked at her wide-eyed. But Tsunade-sama, the gathering. She was cut off as Tsunade shooed her hand to the party. "Fuck the gathering, they can burn for all I care," she said bluntly, making Temari wide-eyed, and now understood why her husband always said she was too blunt for her own good. She was tempted to make her go and see Naruto, but remembered the morning and looked down. Tsunade-sama, he is really busy with the exams and all," she said nervously, making Tsunade scowl and cut off her protest before she could speak. "But I promise you'll see him tomorrow one way or the other," she said, making Tsunade raise an eyebrow at her cryptic words. "I promise," she said firmly, and Tsunade nodded slowly. She was too happy with the news she had heard anyway to be negative, and couldn't wait to meet her blonde Gaki. She pulled her with her, wiping her eyes, and their conversation went on with the two lost in their own conversations as Temari told her how Naruto was and if he was fine. Well, again and again, much to her chagrin. She was happy that the Kages had a separate gathering, and she didn't have to see any other shinobi to ruin her mood. Evening. Naruto walked into the gates of his eyes to see the door locked, and was surprised that Temari hadn't returned until now. He unlocked the door and stepped in. He pulled off his sandals and kept them in the shoe rack walking in. He went to the kitchen and towards the fridge for a bottle of water, when two slender arms slid around his waist from behind, and a small soft form pressed itself on his back, making him smile. "I'm sorry." He heard a small whisper and brought him in front of her, picking her up, and sat her up on the counter to see her puffy red eyes and cheeks and knew she must have been crying. He cupped the both of her cheeks gently and smelt the smell of liquor, and saw the slight blush on her cheeks over their puffiness. "Haim, have you been drinking?" he asked softly in a concerned voice, and she smiled and nodded with droopy eyes, pointing her fingers to a small amount on the empty bottle in her hand with a small slurry smile. "Just a little." He heard her small whisper with a hiccup and glanced back to see their cabinet of liquor open and several empty bottles lying around the ground, making him sigh as he pulled her close in a hug. "You shouldn't be drinking so much, Haim. It's not good for you," he said softly, cradling the drunk girl in his arms while she snuggled in his embrace with a sob. "It made me forget," she said with a hiccup, and he rubbed her back softly, making her feel fuzzy and smile, feeling his hands over his. She tightened her hold on him and smiled. She missed feeling this safety even for a few hours. "Forget what?" he asked gently, and heard another soft sob and kept rubbing her back gently. "I felt so scared that you hated me after I made fun of our moment like that," she said, now crying in his arms and hugging him tightly. Naruto smiled softly and hugged her gently and brought her sniffing and cute face in front of him, wiping it softly like a little child as she giggled slurrily with a hiccup. "I could never hate you, Mari-chan," he whispered softly, and she looked at his warm and concerned eyes and hugged him. "I'm sorry, really I didn't mean to, I just..." She was cut off as Naruto pressed his lips onto her softly in a small kiss and looked at her lovingly. "It's all right," he said reassuringly, and she sniffled in his arms like a little child. "Naruto-kun," she whispered, and he smiled, brushing her blonde, unruly locks softly in his hair. "Hi, Mari-chan," he asked softly, and she smiled, snuggling in his chest. "Aishitaru," she whispered softly, making him smile and kiss her head softly as he cradled his cute girl in his arms. "Aishitaru Mari-chan," he said softly, and she nodded in his chest, feeling nice in his arms. "Naruto-kun, take me to bed," she said softly, and he smiled and swept her off her feet and carried her to their room and put her on the bed gently. He tried to walk away when she caught his wrist and looked at him pleadingly. "Stay," she whispered, biting her lip, and he nodded with a soft smile, taking off his jacket, and got into bed with her. She cuddled up to him and her eyes drooped from the alcohol in her system. "Naruto-kun, I'll make it up to you, I'm sorry," she whispered with a cute yawn, and her eyes drooped in sleep, making him smile. He brushed her hair softly and kissed the top of her head while she lulled herself to his rhythmic heartbeat. "Shh, sleep now, we'll talk tomorrow," he whispered, and she nodded as he felt a small drop on his neck and saw a tear leak from her eye before she fell asleep, making him smile sadly. "My baka blonde wife, I love you too much," he whispered, closing his eyes as he looked at the softly breathing mop of sandy blonde hair on his chest with a small smile, and pulled her closer while he too fell asleep. Next morning, Temari woke up to a splitting headache and sat up a bit, holding her head with a groan. "I drank too much," she whispered to herself, feeling the intense headache, and saw the empty bed beside her and teared up. She buried her face in her hands and cried to herself. "He didn't come home, he hates me," she sobbed to herself when the door to the room opened, startling her, and in came Naruto with a tray full of breakfast. He got into bed and put the tray on her lap, kissing her head softly, making her blush from his tender treatment. She watched him with childlike eyes, sniffing a bit when she saw his warm smile. He picked up a small tablet from the tray and put her in front of her mouth with his finger under her chin. "Mari-chan, open your mouth," he said softly, and she opened it a bit as he placed the pill in and put the glass of orange juice to her lips as she swallowed it and saw him sit beside her and pull her close to him in a warm hug, rubbing her arm and kissing her head softly, making her snuggle in his arms. My baka Haim, what were you thinking drinking so much? You had 7 bottles of sake from what I counted in the cabinet. He said softly, scolding her, and she hugged him tightly. 10. She whispered, and he looked at her surprised with a mild glare, making her look down. I had 3 at the party too. She whispered, biting her lip, and saw his glare when she heard him sigh and pull her in a bear hug. You're not angry, she whispered, and he chuckled softly, surprising her. I think you don't remember last night, huh? I forgave you last night, when you fell asleep in my arms, Haim. He said softly, making her smile childishly in his arms as she tightened her hold on him. You were with me last night, she asked, blushing, and he nodded, kissing her head, brushing her blonde locks. Of course I was. Where would I go other than my Haim's arms? Plus, you weren't letting me go, you know. He said playfully, and she punched his chest softly with a blush. Of course I wasn't, you're mine. She said softly, and he chuckled and nodded. Hi, and you're mine, Haim. Now have breakfast, you skipped on dinner for sake last night too. You need the most important meal of the day. He said softly and started feeding her, much to her embarrassment, but she liked being treated like that, with his warm smile and loving eyes looking at her so tenderly. She fed him back slowly with the same affection as he moved the tray aside and sat with her settled on his lap. He kept running his fingers in her hair softly. I was worried, you know, so much sake can harm you. He said softly, and she nodded in his chest. I'm sorry. She whispered, and he kissed her lips softly and gave her a heartwarming smile. But I'm glad you drank at home, where you were safe and could sleep in my arms with me watching over you. He said softly, and she looked down, blushing a bit, making him curious. I went to Kankuro and Garata, you know. She whispered, and he looked at her with his eyebrows shot up and heard her. Well, Gara told me to come back, and that you would forgive me instantly. She whispered, and he smiled and kissed her forehead softly. And he was right. He said softly, and she nodded with a blush. But I was scared, and my gaze turned to the liquor cabinet, and she trailed off, and he smiled and hugged her. Looks like I'll have to refill the cabinet, Annie, he said playfully, and she giggled and nodded. The finals are today, Haim. He said softly, and she nodded in his chest, seeing they had a couple of hours, and looked at him. We should take a bath, I'll prepare the tub. She said, blushing, and he chuckled and nodded. Hi, and today only a bath, and no making out or anything. He said, and she tried to argue when he put his fingers on her lips. I don't want to break my promise now that we have skipped out a day, another won't matter. But be ready, because tomorrow I'll make love to you from dawn till dusk. He said softly, rubbing her cheek, and she nodded with a blush, dreaming how good it would feel to make love for so long. They took a simple bath that took half an hour, with them talking to each other softly about their looking forward to their start of a family before they got out and started getting dressed. Temari put on her underwear as she looked at him in his pants, and got behind him, wrapping her arms around his naked torso, feeling his warm body she loved so much. Where are you going to be today, Narukuin? She asked, and he smiled, looking at the scroll with the official Kazakage seal with a small smile. Ogara has given me a special duty today. He said softly, and brought her hand up from his chest, kissing it softly, making her smile and turn him around. She wrapped her slender arms around his neck and looked at him lovingly, while he kept his hands on her hourglass naked waist in just her black laced bra and panties. What duty? She asked softly, and he smiled mischievously and shook his head. Oh, you'll see, it's a surprise. He said, and she looked at him pleadingly when he gave her a soft kiss with a smile. You'll be surprised, all right. He said, grinning, making her pout and causing him to laugh as they started getting ready for the day.
Hey guys, thank you for all the support on the last video. I'm in a rush because I gotta go to dinner. So thank you guys so much for all the likes. If we can get, let's go, 100 likes on this part for the next part. Um, Thank you guys for all the support. Thank you guys for 400 subscribers. That's crazy. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you in the next part. Bye bye.